Appreciate it. It doesn't seem that long ago that I was an undergraduate here at the University of Michigan. I was not a particularly good student. My first term freshman year, I got a 2.100 grade point average. My second term, I got a 2.103, which, thank you. For me, that was progress. My sophomore year, I took History 160, which was Intro to American History. And I vividly remember one lecture from that class. It was in Angel Hall in a big auditorium. The professor was Shaw Livermore. He was a brilliant, deeply learned man in his 60s then. He was reading from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America about the cultural differences between aristocratic societies and democratic ones. He concluded with precisely this passage. Aristocracy had made a chain of all the members of the community, from the peasant to the king. Democracy breaks that chain and severs every link of it. Thus, not only does democracy make every man forget his ancestors, but it hides his descendants and separates his contemporaries from him. It throws him back forever upon himself alone and threatens in the end to confine him entirely within the solitude of his own heart. Professor Livermore was visibly shaken at the end of that passage. And I remember finding myself perplexed that this very impressive person, for whom I already had great respect, was shaken by a passage from one of our reading assignments. I was perplexed because at that time, I didn't take our assignments all that seriously. After class, I walked alone with my thoughts along a leafy sidewalk near the Diag. I was thinking rather hard about Professor Livermore's reaction to that passage, trying to make sense of it. And finally, I realized Professor Livermore was moved by that passage because what we're studying here is actually important. And so maybe I should take this work seriously. And so with some fits and starts, I began to do that. That walk changed the course of my college career. About 18 months later, near the end of my junior year, I was again walking by myself, this time along the sidewalk in front of Angel Hall. The trees were just starting to get their leaves. I had recently written a paper about a book by 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I really enjoyed writing that paper, and I started to think about the reasons for that. I remember thinking, I like the analytical work that I'm doing in my history and philosophy classes, and I really like the writing. And then I thought, I should go to law school, because as a lawyer, I'll get to do both of those things. That walk set the course for my professional career. Looking back years later, I realized that there was something special about those walks, something that made possible the insights that I had during them. That something was solitude. Now, by solitude, I don't mean being physically alone. There were plenty of other people around during those walks. By solitude, rather, I mean the condition of being alone with your thoughts, an absence of input from other minds, as Mike Irwin and I put it in Lead Yourself First. That condition, being alone with my thoughts, allowed me to do some analytical thinking during those walks. And it allowed me to be introspective, to look inside myself, to see what was going on there, and to make some life decisions as a result. But those walks might not have turned out the same way today, because if I did those walks today, I might instead be doing this, looking at my phone, or I might be listening to a podcast. And if we're doing either of those things, we're not alone with our thoughts. We're bringing someone else's thoughts or someone else's emotions, oftentimes not positive ones, inside our heads. And so if there had been smartphones back in 1987, I might not have had those insights about school and about the kinds of work that I found fulfilling. because I might have been looking at Facebook or someone's Twitter feed instead. Solitude used to be something that came as a matter of course to almost everyone. But today we are losing solitude without even realizing it. Mostly because of these handheld devices and social media apps that are quite deliberately designed to be addictive. Solitude today is like a beautiful animal whose habitat is being destroyed. Solitude now takes a conscious choice to put away our phones, to be with our thoughts, and to access the richness that awaits us there. I first started thinking seriously about solitude back in 2010 when I was having a beer with Mike Irwin at Conor O'Neill's on Main Street. Mike was an Army officer on active duty then, studying to get his master's degree in leadership psychology here at the University of Michigan. He had been deployed to the Middle East 3 times. Mike's an extrovert and I'm an introvert, but we ended up talking about our respective experiences with solitude. Mike talked about how during his first deployment to Iraq, he would walk rather than ride to the chow hall each day, a mile each way, and temperatures around 100 degrees. On some of those walks, he would think about a leadership problem he was facing. On other walks, he would steady himself emotionally. I talked about my barn office in northern Michigan, in the woods overlooking Upper Lake Huron. That's the view from my barn office. This is it for slides in this presentation. It's low tech. Whole thing's very low tech. So I always say I get an extra 20 IQ points in that office because I don't have any cell service or internet connection there. So I don't have part of my brain wondering if I've gotten some email or text or whether there might be something interesting on some website. It's like having all the cookies taken off of my brain, I guess. I don't really know what cookies are, but I'm told that fits. So I'm able to focus completely on whatever I'm doing in that office. And so whatever I'm working on in that office seems to go pretty well. At the end of that conversation with Mike, we decided to write a book about solitude, and that book became Lead Yourself First. Like Lindsay said, we spent 7 years researching and writing it. And we learned that successful people have used solitude throughout history, oftentimes without recognizing it as such. And we learned that solitude comes in different forms. There's the big form of solitude, like Thoreau spending months alone at his cabin on Walden Pond, or me going up to my barn office for a couple of days to write an opinion. But solitude comes in smaller, more accessible forms too. You can be alone with your thoughts when you're walking to or from class, or when you wake up in the morning, or if you drive somewhere. And during those times, you can choose to think about a specific subject or problem. I call that focused reflection. These things are easy to do. We just have to put our phones in airplane mode for a little while. Mike and I also learned that solitude enhances a number of qualities that make people wiser, more successful, more fulfilled. One of those qualities is clarity, and that's what I found during my walks around campus. Complex problems are solved by careful analytical thinking, and that kind of thinking happens only in solitude. Dwight Eisenhower used solitude to think clearly during World War II. He had a practice of writing memoranda to himself as a way of thinking through complex decisions. Most notably, he did that on June 3rd, 1944, as a way of thinking through the decisions he would make on D-Day. And because of that memo, as we describe in the book, when that day came, Eisenhower made the right decisions. Another quality that solitude enhances is emotional balance. I remember when I was in law school, I would, after final exams each spring, I would drive up north and fly fish and camp by myself in the woods up there. That was emotionally restorative after the stress of final exams. I might have to do that after this talk as well. We'll see. It's a bad time of year, but being connected with nature rather than being connected with your phone can bring you to a more peaceful place. Solitude also allows us to reflect before we react. Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl is credited with this quote: "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." Social media reduces that space to nothing, but solitude elongates that space. It allows us to reflect on the reasons why someone might be acting in a way we don't like. And if we do that honestly, if we do that with a measure of grace, we often find that those reasons have nothing to do with us. And sometimes those reasons lead us to have sympathy for the other person. Maybe that person had a difficult childhood, or maybe someone she loves is gravely ill. Where at first we feel anger, solitude can bring magnanimity and peace. The last quality brings all the others together: moral courage. Moral courage is what we need when we're subject to moral criticism. Moral criticism is when someone says, you're not simply mistaken because of what you believe or what you choose to do, but that you're a bad person because of those things. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was subject to intense moral criticism during his leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to 56. One night in January 1956, King came home around 11:30 p.m. King's Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, David Garrow, said that this was the most important night in King's life. King's wife, Coretta, and their baby daughter, Yolanda, were already asleep. The phone rang. The caller said, "We're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." Those were not idle threats in those days. King hung up the phone and felt something start to break inside of him. He sat down alone in solitude at the kitchen table. As King described it later, he said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right, but I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering, I'm losing my courage." And then King said he heard an inner voice saying, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you until the end of the world." He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me alone. King knew very well the dangers that he faced in the service of his cause. But from that night forward, he never again feared what any man might do to him. King's faith was one of his first principles in life. I urge every one of you to reflect on your first principles, to identify them, and periodically to assess how well your actions conform to them. If you do that, you'll find yourself starting to become an inner-directed person rather than an externally directed one. You'll be less needy for the praise or approval of others. And when they criticize you, you'll be more resilient. Because if you do these things, the praise or criticism that will matter most to you is your own. I know there's a lot of pressure these days, always to do things in groups. Believe me, I felt that pressure myself over the years. So I will tell you this: give yourself permission to spend time in solitude. In solitude, you can find clarity and peace and courage. You can transcend the entropy around you. There is a glory and a fulfillment waiting inside of every one of you, if only you have the discipline to seek it. Thank you.